Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, gathered virtually with Jody Minnis and Drew Weech. Major thank you to Turn Gallery and to everybody who's joining us this evening. My name is Tiera Ndlovu. I'm a Bahamian South African art historian and curator. I serve as the Curatorial Research Associate at the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach. I'm also the founder of Baja Archives, which is an independent digital archive of Bahamian life, kind of centered on highlighting our collective memories and our cultural traditions. Before I get into kind of why we are, you know, what we're going to be speaking about today, I'd love to give my panelists an option to introduce themselves very briefly. Jody, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for signing on, and thank you once again, Tiara, for being here and hosting this conversation. And thank you, Drew, for being in conversation with me through this exhibition. Like Tiara said, my name is Jody Minnis. I'm a visual artist, writer, and curator living in and based in the Bahamas. My work centers, I don't know what it centers right now. That's something that's quite fluid. But yes, I'm just happy to be here.
And Drew?
All right, I'm Drew Weech. I'm a painter from the Bahamas, but based in New York. And my work is currently centered around a mixture of lived experiences, stories passed down, and sort of like found imagery that speak to performance as it relates to home.
Thank you both. And I chuckled when Jody said that, she didn't know what her work maybe is centering on right now, but I think we're going to still have a very dynamic discussion, and maybe some of those things will be illuminated this evening. And I'm so sad that I haven't been able to see the show in person, but the installation really is so beautiful. Balancing Act at Turn Gallery will be on view until this Saturday, July 1st. So if you are in Nassau and you haven't visited the show, please consider adding Turn to your weekend plans. You will not be disappointed by any means. And this two-person show, putting Jody and Drew's work together, for me, what I'm seeing in all of those conversations is this interaction with historical imagery, photography, in a way that is kind of tongue in cheek, but also really critically engaging with the way we as Bahamians see ourselves, we see our nation, and all of its possibilities. I think this reflection on our past too is something that in this current moment, as we prepare to celebrate 50 years of independence, it's something that's really prevalent now that we're speaking about. But I do also want to recognize just every individual, scholars, artists, and everyone in between that has been engaging in these kinds of discussion before this kind of commemorative moment. And I'm excited to continue this discourse with you two tonight. Um, so just wanted to touch on your background. I know, Jody, you said that you're living and working in the Bahamas. Could you speak to where you were born, where you kind of grew up?
Yeah, so I was born here in Nassau. I spent most of my life here. So I went through all of my education up into my associate's degree was in Nassau, and I got my associates from the then College of the Bahamas, and then I went off to school in Tampa, and I studied at the University of Tampa under Kendra Furp and a few other great artists there. And then I came back home in 2019, and I've been working. As a arts administrator and a visual artist. So over the past 10 years, I've been working as a visual artist and an arts administrator simultaneously. So that's what birthed my curatorial practice. And I've worked specifically in institutions. So I've worked as the gallery assistant at the National Art Gallery, which then led me to interrogate the National Collection a bit more, which has a lot of historic photographs from Jacob Coonley, William Henry Jackson, and persons of that nature. And then transitioning from simultaneously working at the Central Bank of the Bahamas Art Gallery, which is very focused on student artwork. Well, their programming then. I was able to see how students were dealing with contemporary ideas of like socioeconomic issues. So balancing, witnessing how our lived experiences now through the mouth of like babes versus like how we're depicted in these like archives in the National Art Gallery helped to like um, create this tension that my work currently like comes out of, like
Mhm.
what happened then, what is happening now, and how we all sit in the midst of both of those places.
Right. Thank you.
So I was born in Nassau, raised there, went to St. John's from kindergarten straight through to 12th grade. Uh, but I spent a lot of my time between Nassau and Exuma, which is where my mom's side of the family's from. And I've never been to Bimini, but that's where my dad's side of the family is from. Um, After high school, I moved to Canada and did graphic design at university, at NASCAD University in Halifax from I was there roughly from 2004 to 2010, and that's when I moved back to Exuma and spent the better part of 8 years there. And that's around the time I started painting full time because there was no real overlap for me while I was at university because I didn't study painting. I did graphic design and art history. So, oh, and a bit of photography. And so I started painting then and basically been at it full time or part time ever since.
Mm-hmm.
But I initially started painting more colorful images that were more about my prepubescent years, like those early years, and then I started to have more of an interest in home and the idea of home overall. So that's what my current work is centered around.
Right. And I'm actually just learning in this conversation now that you kind of both were abroad, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on if that experience of growing up in Nassau and New Providence, and or also in Exuma, and then studying abroad and then returning home, if that has impacted your practice or anything in that sense.
Yeah, I think one of the things that uh, any sort of any Bahamian, I think, would say to be true is that when you're outside of the country, you become like this ambassador for the country because we operate under these like very heavy touristic ideals. So we feel like we have to represent the country, we have to like share and like teach about the country no matter what situation we're in. And then we also have to like be responsible for the image of the country that would lie in whoever's minds that we meet. Like we are responsible for that once people uncover that we're Bahamian. So yeah, definitely. I think being in school in Tampa specifically, but I think it was a bit easier because Kendra Ferber was there for quite some time. So the kind of like vernacular of Bahamian like creative making, they were already familiar with it. So when I went in, they actually gave me an opportunity to not do that. So they said, you don't have, you could put your like, you could take your pin off. You don't have to be like Miss Bahamas. If you want, like, if you want to engage with these things, if you want to bring your cultural heritage into your work, you can. But that was the first instance where I was actively aware that I had the choice to not engage in that way. So I think in that, um, I still said, yeah, I will engage because like I'm actually like curious about it, but I'm less curious about it in a way that like furthers and supports the narratives that we've been told, um,
Mhm.
but in a way that's like critical, but not critical in a very like plain academic sense, but like a cheeky satirical kind of I'm a dry humor kind of girl, like so I just like I find a lot of things funny, so I enter a lot of things in my life from that perspective, like, oh, I found this funny, or I found this interesting, and then I allow that to be like kind of like a generator in my work.
So for me, I know, even though I was away from home for a long time, I didn't feel like I was away from home because a lot of Bahamians go to Halifax, and even though they weren't in my like core friend group, I was always running into people from home, and then I was always on the phone with my grandmother or my dad, or so I always still had that connection, and so I found that I was never homesick, and also my best friend lived there as well. So it was just one of those things where I never even thought about kind of like missing home or home in terms of exploration through my visual practice until I was home for a few years. And I think as time went on, I became more and more aware how visually we kind of cover the same things in the same ways a lot, and it wasn't until I first met John Cox maybe like 23 years ago when I did like a semester at COB that I realized that you could be an artist in the Bahamas that wasn't sort of making like what most people would look at as like Bahamian art, and but it still took another like 14 years for me to start to explore those ideas on my own. So yeah, so my path to where we are now in terms of like our show together, Jody, it was a decade and a half long path to just to the starting line. So yeah, but I do think being away can influence people because my Bahamian friends back home, I mean, they were pining for home all day, every day. Yeah, they couldn't stop with the sauce and crab and rice and all of that. But for me, because it always felt like I was only physically away from home, but home was still with me, so it didn't affect me in the same way.
Mhm. Thank you both. I think what you've both kind of touched on this notion, Jody, of feeling responsible for the imagery and of how the Bahamas is presented. I see that too with Drew, your comment that when you do look at this typical Bahamian art, and I say this in a very, very general sense, um, when you're thinking about tourism design and promotional aspects and postcards and posters and things, you do start to see those common iconography. And I actually think this video we'll show now, it's a promotional film that was taken in the 1950s. And so for everybody that's watching at home, there are multiple versions really of this film, but this one I thought was really, really powerful because you'll see the caricatures very early on in this film that both Jody and Drew's work is addressing and subverting when we talk about resisting the visual archive through this show. So if we can go ahead and get that.
Of the Bahamas, one of Great Britain's self-governing colonies. Its capital city, Nassau, is situated on the island of New Providence, about the size of Staten Island in New York Harbor. And to the harbor of Nassau, as calm as a pond, come great ocean liners, loaded with passengers headed for this haunt of happiness and carry of summer sport. Immediately, the sea-going giant is surrounded by native black boys in small boats, eager to dive for flashing coins that will be thrown from crowded decks. Because of shallow shoals, a tender is drawn up to take off passengers who literally step across a threshold of romance. The landing is the introduction to much that is delightful, strange, and fascinating. Along the wharf, women of rather good size are seen making mats, baskets, and hats by braiding together strips of dry palm leaves. And what lady just off the boat could resist buying a new hat here, handmade in the very latest Nassau style, smartly modeled? Bahamian baskets of sisal are famous for their variety of color and form, and the women who preside over the wares are as picturesque as the merchandise. Both present a quaintness in coloring that is unique. Policemen, proud of their positions, shine as directors of traffic. They are selected with care and are well trained. A reminder of old Nassau is the Queen's Staircase, a flight of 66 steps cut from the solid rock.
I never like to watch that video. It's never. I mean,
That was so cringe.
But I think it speaks to the origins, right? Of we think about how long our country has been promoted as somewhere that other people can come, and it's their leisure space, and the Black people that live in the Bahamas are here as in servitude. But just breaking down what we saw, right? So the beginning, you have a ship coming in, and immediately the narrator is speaking about coin divers. And I guess this is a mid-century 1950s film, but there are images of coin divers that are in the Library of Congress archive from the 1900s, right at the turn of the century. I don't know if we can bring that up very quickly as well. And speaking to a point that Drew had earlier, right, that we start to see this imagery repeated over and over and over again, but in very similar ways. So you have a photograph on the top left corner that was then produced into a postcard on the bottom left. And then again, in 1914, more images of these coin divers. And actually, I'll kind of bring this to Drew. Was there a particular image that you were looking to or that you recall that you first saw that then kind of sparked your engagement in your practice? Figure?
So I happen to just be looking for historical images because for a few years before my grandmother passed, every time we would speak, she would take me on this visual, verbal tour of growing up back home. And so I would start looking for things based on like what she said. And if it was, or I would create it on my own. But I thought, it would be nice to have like a set of visuals to kind of work with, to subvert, and to make a set of paintings. And in doing so, I came across coin divers, which I think by the time as I was born in '84, it may not have been a thing anymore. And so I mentioned it to her, and she knew what they were. She was born in '38. My dad was born in '52. He also remembered. He was like, yeah, like I remembered that, but like my mom, she wouldn't let us go out in boats in, deep water by a cruise ship or whatever to dive for coins. And that's, it's like pretty dangerous, even though it looks so sort of like banal. And so once I found it, I that's what sort of brought my interest to it. So I kind of stumbled upon them to answer the question.
And was that the imagery that you found? I guess I'm also curious, like what time period was that you found? It was just kind of this historical, like this early 1900s, or closer to the 50s?
I think the oldest one I found was in like the 1870s or 80s, something like that. It was like well before the turn of the century, and the most recent one might have been from the 50s. So yeah, there weren't a lot, but what I did find was repeated over and over, which you mentioned, and so I found that to be curious. Um, yeah, so but that's how I came across it. There isn't a whole lot of them out there, at least not for the Bahamas.
Right. And I think we'll actually bring up your work as well now, just to have that visual comparison. I think we can start with maybe study of a diver.
Hmm. Oh, this one is Showtime.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can start with study. And the works that are in this show are, 2023, but do you have other works that are earlier, or when did you really start to contemplate?
So for me, I might sit with an idea for a long time before I actually start to make images about it. And so I would have found the images, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, um, but I didn't start working on any until I think maybe maybe early last year. I would say January of last year was the first painting I did of them, and yeah, so it takes a while for them to actually, come to fruition.
Yes, these really, really powerful kind of taking back in so many ways this act of entertainment that was it really, when you sit and think about it too long,
Hmm.
it's very, very
And
powerful. Mm.
yeah, but one of the things that kind of sticks with me is trying to find the balance of respecting what these people did and do,
Mm.
because it is important, and there's no, like, I see the downside of it in terms of how people tend to view us, like, from the outside, but there's also something beautiful about what they do, and so trying to find that balance between showing what it seems to be and what it is at the same time.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was if you don't mind me interjecting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking when I was thinking about the talk earlier today, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about how, there's this like we come to the archive to see ourselves, to learn about ourselves, to search for a history, and a history that's not readily available to us through text, or the text, even though it is available, it's not accessible, and accessible meaning the price of a book, or the language even of the book. And I was thinking about how, like, with us in particular, I think that your work kind of sits at the antithesis of this, is that what is carried away sometimes is romanticism rather than
Right.
like interrogation. And because it's romanticized, there's no room for criticality. And because there's no room for criticality, there's like, because there's no room for criticality, we are at danger of perpetuating the system again and again, because this is okay, because
Right.
this is beautiful, and it's nice, and it's quaint, and it has this like ephemeralness about it, and we just like love old Nassau. But I think
Mhm.
that your work, I think, drew what I have been living with throughout this show, is that it's not romantic at all.
No, no. Which TT, my wife, would crack up at, because she always says I'm thoughtful, not romantic, which I think is accurate.
That's funny.
But yeah, but that was the reason why I was so excited to know that we would be in this show together, because I do think you have the same sort of like sensibilities and sense of humor, and critical eye when it comes to home. So, if there is beauty in the work, that kind of comes after,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I really appreciate that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go to you.
No, I really do love the organic conversation. As you both know, I wanted that definitely to be
Yes.
front and center tonight. But thinking back to the video that we saw, the next kind of caricature that we are shown or introduced to, so you're on your ship and you come into the harbor and throw your coins, come off, and you'll be met with straw vendors. And a really, really disturbing way, I think, that the narrator describes, delightful, strange, and fascinating, and women of good size, quote unquote,
Yeah.
Right.
whatever that is, and
Whatever that means.
but very much so, I think, is so clearly the mammy figure, which your work,
Right.
like, so directly engages with. And I just wanted to show, similar to the divers, again, how this visual iconography and these cues we see are repeated and repeated. So we have a photograph by Kunli, which is in the NAGB, the National Collection, um, titled "On the Way to Market," and by the mid '80s, Winslow Homer, an American artist, comes. Has a work of the same title, and also has a woman dressed kind of similar, while the one on the left is clearly in a studio. I mean, it's a watercolor painting. He's just put this into a scene. So similar questions kind of for you, Jody, and thinking about, when did you first start to um, reflect on the mammy figure, and how was it introduced to you? Similar things, and we'll bring up your work as well.
Yeah. I think I was it's so funny that you two brought up On the Way to Market, because years ago I was looking for representations of women in our archives, and On the Way to Market is a very prolific figure, because she is there standing there holding it. I think if you could go back, I don't know. I think the chicken is in her hand, but there's also like a basket
One on her head.
Basket, yes.
right,
Mhm.
and then there's like these stuff on her head, and this is clearly in a studio, so it's a staged portrait. So there's questions about like agency. There's questions about consent and permission. There's also in Dr. Krista Thompson's book, An Eye for the Tropics, she talks about how women, in relation to palms and palm fronds in the landscape, were not only just about the kind of promoting of that the idea of the fertility of the landscape, but also this like sense of exoticism and eroticism in the same vein, and women then, Black women, being photographed by the gaze of these like white American and British men, also then furthers the conversation about like agency, consent, permission, and why then would the Nasuvian landscape need to be uh, encapsulated with this propaganda of fertility and life and vitality. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I was thinking about all of these things because being a stately Black woman in the Bahamas, and traversing touristic spaces, there is a certain level of you come up against these expectations of you too being a part of the landscape and being a part of the economy that's going on, and ideas of like agency also coming up again. Like you don't have a choice but to dance with me, because like if you don't dance with me, you'll make everybody else in here uncomfortable because you're breaking the fourth wall. This is what you're supposed to do as like a shapely, beautiful woman in this space, and in thinking about that, I'm thinking about like the woman constantly as the like center of my practice, and womanhood as the center of my practice. And I'm just constantly searching for how Black women come up in our like visual culture and our like how theoretically she exists and practically she exists. And that then takes us to the Bahama Mama. And the Bahama Mama specifically is what I'm dealing with in the Bahama Mama, just in this instance for me now, is centering this mommy archetype because of the salt shakers. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to share too, just a little bit about the books that you selected for one of your works, right? I think as you enter into the gallery, because you not only have, I mean, there's a lot that we could talk about here, but just thinking about womanhood and Black women, as you said that, I immediately thought, so I know definitely there's one Faith Ringgold book. Is that correct?
Yeah, politics to power, I think. So yeah, I think there's a quote, and it's actually like really interesting now that because I just like jotted it down, but I didn't think I was going to use it. But comes from Derek Walcott's Culture of Mimicry. And he says, but we are American even while we were British, if only the geographical sense. And now the shadow of the British Empire has passed through us and over in the Caribbean. We ask ourselves if in the spiritual or cultural sense, we must become American. And I say that because when like Frederick Douglass, like the life, and I think the book is called The Life of Frederick Douglass is on the table. And then you have a book about Black Dadaism, specifically, I think, in the American context. And then you have Faith Ringgold, who is also a African-American, very prolific woman artist on this table with this Bahamian police officer and the piggy bank and the snake plant and so on. I brought up that quote to say that a lot of the thinkings and the musings and the texts and stuff that I actually engage with are like American produced texts and American history that I then like went to first, then came to like a Bahamian context, just because of like the accessibility of it all. Like it's easier to find like books about slavery in America and colorism and so on in the American context, just because scholarship here, even though it is produced, if you don't know, you don't know, you know. So yeah, and then I think I like the qualities of Dadaism, this kind of like this like nonsense that has like that it just wasn't it wasn't supposed to be taken seriously because of like post-war kind of like dealings. They just was like, art is nothing is art, like just like frig it all to the wind. And I've always engaged that from it was always presented to me in a white context. So to like have this book and to be able to learn about Black Dadaism was interested. And then persons like Betty Asar, and Faith Ringgold, their practice and their like visual expression and the way and their like actual like craft influences my work a lot. So that's why they are also on this like coffee table. They're part of like my musings, my readings, to develop kind of the thinkings that I'm doing now.
Thank you. Just got a comment complimenting the books were the favorite part of the show. So I think it's a very, very nice touch, and hearing your response, your reflection on why it was so important to include them too, makes it all the better. So I still haven't forgotten in the back of my head our characters, right? We are caricatures that we were introduced to. So Jody, just to kind of stay with you just a little bit, the next person we saw in that video, that we have to remember that this was something that was shown so that people would visit the Bahamas and be able to recognize. So we have the friendly, I can't remember the exact words, but I know it was something along the lines of, well-behaved policemen. And
They love their job.
yes,
Yes.
Something to that extent.
And they are well prepared.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Which, in this way, we know that relationship that Black Bahamians especially have is different. And these are just some images that we have. Again, this is things that I've sourced for Baja Archives that I thought would be good reference points just for our audience to really see, okay, we keep talking about we're seeing the same things, but let's actually have that evidence. Um, so if you would speak to Jody, the presence of the policeman, I think particularly what I find interesting about some of the prints that you have, the works on paper, it might not show the full uniform, but the hat is so prevalent,
Yeah.
and that's really what you see. So
Yeah. There's like a larger print, and I didn't give it's like behind me on the floor, but I won't be that person to pick it up. But that this actually came. I will be that person to pick it up.
yeah, I was gonna say I don't. Yeah, don't.
But I don't know if you can see it.
Oh yes, I remember seeing this.
Yeah, so this is actually like a woodcut, and it's actually taken from like an archival photo. So in the background of the original photo, there was like the police barracks and so on. So this is evidence once again of me like looking, just like searching, looking for archival material and representations in the archive. And one of the things that you will see in my representations of these officers is their stoicism, which is, I think, because you just see them as like monuments in the space. They too then become a part of the landscape when you are downtown. So they just like stand unless they, need to like help tourists across the street or direct traffic so that tourists can, cross the street safely. It's not about the cars, it's about the tourists. So I see them as like these statuesque, like monolithic figures. And when you think about, I think too, it also like counteracts like the police band. And the police band is also a symbol, or not a symbol, but an entity that you would see continuously in our archives. These like friendly, happy, perpetuators of violence who play instruments.
Yes, dance and
Yeah.
go to Florida and
Mhm.
Yeah, so there's this like I'm really, really interested in violence. I'm really, really interested in violence in my work because I think that a lot of the conversations that we're having, a lot of what we experience is inherently violent because we do not want to be critical about our current state of affairs, because we do not want to be critical about who we were and how a lack of action or a lack or a void or an absence of something then is responsible for the perpetuation and like the state that we are in now. So I use the police officers as representations of violence, as representations of stoicism, as representations of authority, and kind of like the masculine, and not to just like perpetuate binaries, but the masculine versus the feminine. So this like masculinity is shown in the officers, whereas the femininity is shown in the salt shakers. And I guess, sorry.
I thought that work too was a great. If we could go back just one slide.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to like talk about this one, but yeah. So for me, it's about that like it's that violent act of like of looking away, because I think that there are, when you live in the inner city and you live anywhere other than like touristic spaces, that the response time of police officers is very specific. That their presence is you know, it creates tension in the atmosphere, but they are also us. So I'm also thinking about that duality, that if in any moment I could become a police officer. Like, there are men and women that I love that are officers, and we all have like this. We all can enact that violence in this way. So I'm thinking about how it's not just like idiosyncratic to like them. So like the difference between me calling the police or not could be an act of violence in certain spaces if I'm not reading social cues properly. But also, if I don't, then I could also have violence enacted upon me. So it's just like weird duality. Like, these are also the people that will like blow their trumpets and like dance with tourists. You know what I mean? So it's like this very weird duality that I'm dealing with in my work. And I think that that painting is just like the beginning of like trying to like figure out how these two entities exist together.
Yeah. And I'd love, once we are getting closer to the close, to talk more about where you might see that going. I think that that's a powerful relationship that, yeah, absolutely. So Drew, just a question for you about your figures, and we'll now leave our cringy video for now, but get to explore also some other um, imagery that I think we are associated with as Bahamians, across the board. So if we could go to balancing act, actually, which the title of the exhibition comes from. Oh.
No, it's not. Yeah, that
Oh,
one's not in the exhibition.
so sorry.
Yeah.
Um, but okay. Well, what I
Hmm.
was hoping to speak about was, in that work, you do have a figure who's kind of balancing on this beam, um, and has conch shells on one side, on the top left corner, if I remember correctly. But can you speak to what that person's doing, that figure? I mean, it's not the divers that we see in your other works, or even the straw vendors.
So that one came out of it's a found image of a street sweeper,
Mhm.
but I was looking for him specifically because my grandmother was trying to explain to me how they used to make brooms to clean up the wood floors or out on the streets and whatnot, and how important it was for your surroundings to be kept well. And so I juxtaposed him with the conch shells because of this kind of, I guess, circus-like idea of home, of you see people doing these like mundane things that we don't think much of. Like, we all, if we like, can't go down to Arawaki or under the bridge to Porterski and get our conch, and that's that. But to other people, it's like this beautiful image of paradise, right? And same thing with the street sweepers, like the native doing this thing that he, she, or they aren't thinking about, but it's somehow uh, romanticized. And so that was I guess, a Dada-esque image that I painted, where he's the more important figure to me, or the more important part of the painting to me, because he's just seeing him instantly made me think of older people in my family, and what their reality was at that time, like in the 40s and 50s. But he's he's a cardboard cutout, right? So if these conch shells that tend to have a bit of weight to them falls onto it, then he's catapulted sort of out of the picture, and so that side is given more importance, I think, to people on the outside versus what we on the inside look at, and it's a thing, and it's a beautiful thing, but it's just a part of our everyday lived experience.
Mhm. And there's something that you mentioned right at the beginning there that I'd love to go deeper into, which is this idea of it being like a circus act.
Mhm.
So I know we have some works in the show that kind of the background, at the very least, does kind of have that set. And curious if there's any continuity between these scenes. Some of the scenes as well have figures like in Showtime, Star of the Story. Um, they almost seem to be tethered, right? They have these kind of
Mm.
um, yeah. So is there any continuity there between any of your works that you would like to share?
Yeah, so that idea of the circus and performing was something that I've been interested in for years, and some time ago I saw at the Met. Oh, there's Balancing Act.
Oh,
Um, but I saw at the Met a show that was based on the circus in France, and so it had like some Suras and I think Honor Daumier and some others in the show, and I bought the book, and I was just really interested in that idea of performance. And as Jody was speaking earlier, it made me think about the accessibility to history elsewhere that we don't necessarily have back home, um, or it exists, but you really have to dig to find it. And so I just started thinking in terms of how to, uh, I guess, marry these two ideas of like the reality of that lived experience versus what it what it feels like, and how other people sort of interact with us.
hmm
But to speak to historical things that most people don't know about because of that sort of lack of access, we go back to a sad state of affairs that um, that that used to be Hobby Horse Hall Racetrack,
hmm
which would have been off the old Cable Beach Strip. And
Right.
I always saw something in the back there, and I remember my dad saying, "Oh, that used to be a racetrack." And so a few years ago, I became interested in it, and I found some images of it. And you have all these movie stars that would go there to see um, the races and whatnot. But the reality of it was these horses were either drugged up to perform for X amount of time, or they were just being left to their own devices. And there's stories of like horses being like falling into wells, and the rats would be fighting them for food because like they were just treated so poorly. And so that's where the idea of this particular painting came from.
hmm
But again, just keeping with that idea of like you're on show, but there's something kind of dark going on at the same time.
hmm And I recall from the walkthrough that Turn hosted that Ramel had mentioned that these horses are going in the opposite direction. And I'd love if you
Mm.
could kind of share about your intention with that, and considering this merry-go-round go round, it's not really going to perform very well if that is the case.
Right, exactly. Well, it's kind of like you're going in opposite directions, but considering it's the merry-go-round, if it was actually moving, you're going to clash at some point. Like, things are going to come to a head, and so there's only four horses represented or in the painting, but one is this emaciated horse that came from a photograph that I found like it would have been in the dying days of the racetrack, and the other one is souped up in the middle of a race, and so they just show that sort of duality. of what was really happening at the time.
Right. And I'm just curious, just the archivist in me, on where you found those images, because I myself have kind of been on this hunt for anything about um, that racetrack and the location um,
I think
and
it
its
was the
challenging events.
Cacique International or something like that.
Ah, yes.
I think they had a short story on it, and the other one was a guy who he ran the Humane Society at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, um, he did a story in one of the papers. And when it came out, he said, people showed up to his house with like machetes and stuff because as bad as things were for these animals, they still served a purpose in terms of like people's livelihood and
Mm-hmm.
all that. So that speaks to an even darker side of at least the human side of what was going on. So they came from a mixture of both. But I'll send you the links.
Awesome. Yeah. um, just always great, I think, to be able to engage in that way and learn more, because as we've all shared this evening, a lot of our archives do have this kind of duplicated, this repeated
Mhm.
stories and imagery that you both use in your works. Um, and Jody, your work, you're spanning across multiple media. Is there one that you find most impactful as you or that you're most drawn to, or is it?
No, it all depends on the idea. So I I have a lot of ideas. And then I'm like, okay, what will make this idea what medium best serves this idea? And then I then think about if I want to be transparent or opaque with the idea in the work, and who I want to access the idea readily, and who I want to work for it. So I think, well, I'm a bit playful with my work. And I say playful, not in like an unserious sense. I'm an unserious person, but I'm serious about my work. But I'm playful in that, like, I just, I have the, I have the opportunity to not have like a specific monolithic practice. So if I have that opportunity, I'ma just not do that. And then I also like, I'm around the gallery scene more than the like. I'm an artist who works in a gallery. I'm an artist who's always worked in galleries. So I try to have fun in my work so that fun could then be because this could get monotonous and stuff, and I also have to like live with so you can see my work at work sometimes as well. So I just try to be as experimental and as like whimsical and playful and like yeah, like in that Bahamian kind of way, because I think that there's something culturally about like we're very like funny, chill, comical, like expressive kind of people, like so I want that to be embodied in my work. And I think that's what the varied media, that's where the varied media comes from.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm glad that you also brought up your work that's in the back, because I was like, I'm pretty sure those are photographs,
Yeah.
but I didn't want to call out, didn't want to be that person. But it's also some great images that speak to, again, this idea of the you're still, I think, contemplating and challenging and subverting in very effective ways.
Yeah.
And then Drew, I know that you beyond this body of work are working in black and white, but if you could speak to the significance of that throughout your practice, and maybe even for these works, if it's any added sense.
So some years ago, I decided to remove color from my palette, like completely. And I've recently began, bringing it in and as like what do you call it? A supporting figure. It was this supporting thing, uh, but it was because I really disliked how kind of bombastic most of our work tends to be. And when people see Bahamian work, Bahamian art, or when they think of it, they tend to think, really pretty, colorful, use every color possible. And I sort of struggle with saying that because there's so many Bahamian artists who paint like that, whose work I really love. Like I grew up with a lot of Amos Ferguson's in the house, and um, there are other artists who are like always painting like very colorful works, but it's not that they're very significant. But it was just one of those things that I thought, well, can I get my point across? Can I still paint and have people sort of stop and pay attention without that? Like color to me was always like the that very kind of attractive thing. Like people just they're drawn to it without even realizing it. And so it became more interesting for me just for my own practice to remove it and try to communicate without it. And yeah, but I what's interesting is that you just asked Jody about her practice overall, and one of the questions I had for Jody, which she just answered, was if she placed any sort of like restrictions in terms of like the making. That happens to be my restriction on myself, especially for this body of work is specifically about island life or Bahamian life.
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
but I
Jody.
like restrictions.
Yeah, I think I give myself restrictions in the problem, and then I try
Mm,
to solve it in the most expansive way. That makes sense.
nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it does. Yeah, that's pretty dope. And I
Yeah.
really like I love the fact that go back one slide, please.
Yeah, the keepsakes. I just noticed something.
Yeah,
The
The
hand.
yeah, those two works together hits me
Yeah.
right in the feels.
yeah,
Mhm. Yeah. Rumela and Amanda did a good job.
yes,
They did.
absolutely.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
I just had a question that I put on my notepad too. I was going to say, is there any works that you guys see that really speak well to each other? But I think this is absolutely.
Oh, listen,
Hmm.
there's I don't know. I was like, I feel like I need to form like a duo with Drew and just do this all the time.
Yes, yes. We should get the gallery to like get a space here and do it here as well. That
Yeah,
would
like
be
I just there's so much to what like I think like sorry, I like my brain has been like academic all week, but there's so much to
cool.
your work, Drew, that I there was a talk by Dr. Julia Smith. Um I hope Smith is the last name at the NAGB very recently. And she was talking about another Caribbean artist practice. And she was saying how and the word inhospitable came up. And
Mm,
I mean, obviously it's a very common word, but I was like, wow, yes, Drew and I are very big proponents in our work for inhospitality, like being
mm,
anti-his hospitality. And not because there I just think because it's mandatory, and then I think that we should have the right to rebel and rebel against things that are mandatory without
right.
the like I think that there's something very like beautiful about not smiling at tourists and just like
Yeah.
and like living in that
Hmm.
agency. And I feel like this show specifically within like the context of like Turn at large did not smile at any guest that entered the space.
Right.
It did not provide any sort of like context or entryway, or like it didn't like pull you in. The only warmth that you got was because this beautiful eggplant that's on the wall, but then this like color is also like very like out of context for the Bahamas. You know what I mean? Like this
Hmm.
purple. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm like, wait, is something in this? I just need to keep doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely looked at the images when Amanda and Ramel sent them over, and I was like, I wish I was home. And I really don't get homesick, although I love home, but I just, I don't know,
I
I've
get
always
it.
been odd like that. But that was the first time I was like, damn, like I wish I was there to actually experience that, you know.
Yeah, I'm glad that the colors of the wall also felt rebellious and inhospitable. That's great.
Hmm.
That's
Yes, yes.
and I think even like Drew saying that he doesn't use color because it's like an invitation. It like because it's color is like the thing. It's the shiny, flashy thing that draws people in, and then people sometimes are not. Depending on the context of the work, they don't enter it in a critical sense if certain colors are within the work. And I also try to limit my color palette because of that as well. So I only use like very warm colors in my work, even if it is like a bright color, it's warm.
Hmm.
Or I try to use red a lot because red is like reds and oranges and yellows because of that like degree of like warning and hazard and all of that. So
Yeah.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you, someone asked me this recently, which was, you know, what do I want people to take away, or do I want people to take it away anything from my work? And my initial reaction was, I don't care. And
I,
it felt, and it's really odd for me speaking to people in the art world, because especially here in New York, you hear like community thrown out a lot, and it's, you know, what's kind of expected is a more like kumbaya type way of like doing everything, not
yeah.
just the practice, but interacting with everyone. And I thought, like, I don't, I make the work because I feel like I have to make the work, but and it's great if people see it and they feel something from it, but that's not a prerequisite. Like I don't make anything and think I want people to love this, you know, or
Yeah.
feel whatever.
Yeah. My artwork bullies me. And I think
Mm,
that, yeah. And it's like hard to talk to people who don't make about it, but like it's like like the studio is a contentious space. Like it's
it
not,
is.
you know, the work makes you cry because it's like and it like messes with your sense of self and your confidence and all of these things. So like I'm not
Hmm.
thinking about nobody but my feelings when I'm making this stuff. Um
Exactly.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you mean.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
like
exactly how I am. Like it's me. I mean, it sounds really dramatic to say, but it's like you're doing battle on so many fronts as you're creating. So, you know, the viewer, I appreciate the viewer, but I don't, you know, for me, being an artist is one of those beautiful things where like we get to make our own rules, and we shouldn't have to like, I don't know, acquiesce to everybody else's whims, you know? Like I
yeah,
have a
and I
graphic design degree. I could worry about what other people think when I'm doing design work, you know, but
and
not for art.
and I've spent a lot of time around art historians for the past like 9 days, and I'm like, they have jobs to do. Like it's their job
Mm.
to think. Tiara, it's your job.
Right.
You know, to like think about these things and contextualize them and expand them and then like pull in like other notions from different places and to, you know, like make me look at the work and also the audience in a different way. So
Hmm.
I think, and then it's also the audience's job to come to form an opinion or to
Right.
experience. So
Mhm.
I
Right.
don't want to like impose on anybody's job outside of my
Mm.
job, and all I can do is my job, and that is to make the thing. And after the thing
Mm.
is made, leave me alone. So
Yeah, yeah. That's how I feel all the time.
yeah,
It's
But
like
I'm
not
glad I'm not
of the
the only
program,
one.
so I have to talk about it again.
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
fine. But it's a different. I think it's a different. There's a difference between like tell me about your work and like, hey, I noticed this thing. Can you expand on that? You know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I find when it's more open-ended, I tend to get I'm less inclined to really speak. But if it's something very specific, then I'm happy to do so. And yeah, it's a really odd thing because our practices go well beyond just that the studio work, but that in and of itself is so exhausting that it just a lot of times you I find I don't have the emotional bandwidth for other things. Like I don't know if this was a solo show, I don't know if I would be like, yeah, I'll do a talk. Like it's because you're here to help,
Yeah.
you know. So yeah, I I appreciate you for that.
And I appreciate you as
I'm curious, just as I see you guys interact, I'm thinking about the artist network that you've built. And is there anybody, um, any other shout outs to other artists, whether those are Bahamian artists or artists in New York, Drew, that you are engaged with or thinking about as well as you think about your practice and your next steps or in the
So
past that have been inspiring?
s- okay, for me, I look at a lot of like German artists, and I love painting. That's one of my other things. Like I am in love with painting, um, and so a lot of the artists that I look at tend to be painters, but not exclusively. Uh, I really like what Hugh Hayden does to
yeah.
totally jump off of
So good.
painting. Like my wife for Father's Day bought me his book that just released a few weeks back, um, and so I think he's great. I think Jeffrey Maris is great.
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
genuinely happy to see him like just soar.
Yeah.
Who else? Bonnie Ramirez, who's Dominican,
Yeah.
great young painter, great person too.
Yeah.
Um,
This is sweet.
and one of my absolute favorite painters is Dominique Fong, and I think she's from Ottawa. She's Asian Canadian,
Mm.
um, and yeah, the way she deals with history, and the same thing with everyone else that I've mentioned. Actually, the artists that I think the highest of tend to engage in some way with history, and so yeah, so those would be the people that I give shout out, and there are more as well, but yeah, those come to mind first.
I think for me, Tamika Galanis is like a very, very, very big part of my practice. As a friend, her friendship is a big part of my practice because she is so generous. And like I didn't know what I was doing. Like I was just like, oh yeah, I just be looking at these old photos, and she's like, no, Jody, like that's like an active act of something, Like she gives me language and context to the things that I was doing in my practice very early on, and kind of what's the word, like supporting the academic side of it, like of validating the academic side of my practice. And I thank her for that a lot. And she continues to give me language. And that's why I'm like, I don't know where I am in my practice now, because we started talking about Afro Surrealism and like the manifesto of that and what that means. And I'm like, nah, I gotta like, like this.
Yeah,
When people tell you those things, and then you're like, I gotta like burn all my paintings now and start over.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
I was watching uh, a podcast between a few comedians,
Mm-hmm.
and this comedian Godfrey, he was interviewing Ali Sadiq, and he
Mm-hmm.
was telling him how he watched his recent special, and it pissed him off, and I knew exactly what he meant as soon as he said it. Like
Yeah.
there's something about seeing someone who you respect, um, especially if they're doing what you do.
Mhm.
The way they hone their craft and that sort of
Yeah.
mastery is beautiful, but it also, like you said, makes you want to burn your own work.
Yeah, and we did a studio visit with Jeffrey this week as well, and I
Hmm.
was like going through Jeffrey's. I was like, damn, like I can't even do what I want to do because what I want to do, Jeffrey already did it, and I'm like, because obviously Jeffrey
Hmm.
did it because he's a genius. Um,
Right.
and then every time I talk to Nina, I'm like, wow, where do I put myself?
Yes.
Nina Major, that is. Still trying to live up to being worthy of being called Kendra Ferb's like mentee. So I try to pull a lot of vernacular from like this space because I think that there's there's a convers there's something going on here that I think is like so potent that
Mhm.
I don't feel the need much outside of like Betty Saar and like Faith Ringgold and like even like Alice Walker and all those people's like writings and their works and stuff that are in my foundation.
Mhm.
I don't really feel like I have to move so much outside of here for inspiration or for like
Right.
expansion. Um
Mhm.
because we didn't even like get like there's y'all know
I know.
what I
Yeah. Yeah. I get that.
yeah.
One of the things, as you were talking, one of the things that really stuck out to me is the fact that we all make really different work, but about
The same
essentially the
thing.
same thing. And I think that's really cool. It's like when I think of a lot of my favorite music, it tends to come out of England, and like there's so
Mhm.
many that came out of, say, Manchester, and like the Smiths don't sound like Joy Division, and
Right.
and they don't sound like Stone Roses, but they
Mhm.
have that same sort of shared lived experience from
Yeah.
there. So I think that when I think of contemporary Bahamian art is one of the things that makes me most happy about
Yeah, and I think when I think about the context of the Caribbean, like the Caribbean is having this conversation.
it.
Like the Caribbean is very, very aware of how climate affects us, how climate
Right.
and colonization are the same, like and hand in hand.
Hmm.
How climate, colonization, racism within the Caribbean, all of this tied back to the tourism economy, all of this tied back to like what actually is how are we building our diaspora because we live in ephemeral islands, you know what I mean? So I think that
Hmm.
all of us, because geographically we're dealing with the same things,
Yeah.
it's hard to not be having the same conversation. And I think
Right.
we're just having the Bahamian version of it.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. This is true.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, because sorry, go on. Tia.
No, go, please.
Oh, so I included my friend Sherry Phoenix's work in here, but when I think of like people like Tiffany Smith, who is like Bahamian Jamaican, but photographer living and working in New York.
Mhm.
I also think of like Jory and Jory's work about like the environment and climate and also the tourism economy. And then when you think about like how all of that is dealing with the environment, you go to like Deborah Jack, and then Deborah Jack and Nina's work also talk similarly together. So there's like so
Right.
much people throughout who are is like there will be no danger of the single story
Mhm.
because all of us are adding in our different perspectives to what actually is the lived Caribbean experience as artists.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And just for our audience, if you'd like to put your any questions you have for our artist or comments in the comment section, we'll kind of have a Q&A in just a few. But as we wrap up, boy, now that we've had this conversation, I want to ask you guys 2 questions. So let's see if we can. And I know I shared one of these with you earlier. This phrase of "I live where you vacation." It's something that I know I saw a lot growing up in Nassau, and it's something I continue to see now in South Florida where I'm living. It's often used in this kind of bragging sense on social media. I just want to bring that. Yes, I think this is a great reference to this photo from Jody. The perfect Caribbean island didn't exist, so we created it. But now here we are saying, "I live where you vacation." So curious of your response to kind of that mentality at large.
Well, so this book is actually really interesting because I found it in Print and Matter in New York, and it's actually a book produced by I think it was like this collective in Switzerland, and it's a compilation of travel and postcards from the travel images and postcards from the Caribbean to talk about how colonization and tourism in the 19th and 20th century had an effect on us. And I used images out of that to make some of the collages in the show. So that's how this book comes into context. And then you have, what's that guy's name? The guy who, Italian artist, Cataline, I think, who
Maurizio Catalan.
right, with the six Caribbean biennial and asserting that the Caribbean doesn't have art and all of these things. So
is that the same guy from like who did the banana?
Yeah, same.
Oh, so
same guy.
he does a biennial?
He curated this biennial in St. Croix, I think, or St. Lucia. I'll send you the information, Drew.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it was wild person. But I think it's but I live where you vacation I think it's true in like a general macro sense, and it is very much false in a micro sense because there's nobody vacationing where I live. I live in the heart of New Providence. Like nobody's there. Nobody's coming there to like
right.
to relax, like I don't even go home to relax.
That's the thing, right? I mean, most people drive up and down what's that, the Northern Street, that one road, and the only time they really veer off is either to get to Shirley Street or to get to Paradise Island.
Yeah,
and that's about it.
Yeah, so unless you live in like Exuma or the Family Islands, I think persons who live in the Family Islands would have like a different response to that because like Exuma is Exuma, Eleuthera is Eleuthera. And there's no real separation in regards to like all-inclusive hotels creating like landscape barriers. But I also think we have to be real about like me spending maybe like $100 in Bahama at a bar is not equivalent to someone spending like $1,200 to stay there for 3 nights.
Right.
Like it's not the same.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's real in one sense and very much false in another. There is some like overlap, I guess there, but it's one of those like random things that people use as this badge, but they don't think about it themselves.
Right. And then I think it also then like erases the fact that this place is anxiety inducing for most. It's like it's the very opposite of like relaxation and reprieve for the majority of the people that like exist in this land. And I think too, I heard someone say like they compared like the amount of tourists that we get on an annual basis to the population and try to use that, the Bahamian population, try to use that as like kind of to affirm tourism and affirm the fact that, if we have like 13 million people like coming in and out, but we only have like 300,000 people, you know what I mean? But I'm just saying, you still gotta take into consideration the stagnant people, like being going nowhere. So maybe you should check for us as well.
Yeah.
And I live
that just reinforces that idea of like living to serve and to make other people, you're spending so much time making other people's temporary reality great while yours is being left in the dust.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. So I'll go to our question that we have for Drew. Do you paint realism in black and white as well, or mostly in forms of expressionism?
If I paint
realism in black and white as well, or mostly in forms of expressionism?
I guess realism would be the current state of my work, but I haven't veered off into any other states yet. So I would say just that for now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so bad at this. I'm like, I think of the most succinct way of saying things, and then I leave all sorts of like negative space.
You're good.
But yeah. Mm-hmm. But thanks for the question.
And did we have any other audience members that wanted to? I guess we can give it not to prompt us to have like awkward silence.
Right.
No, like that, so I'll just keep.
Like I said, I've been talking for a long. My mouth is tired of me. My tummy leaves me.
And I am very hungry. So my 2 hours of sleep.
This is
yes, this is a good reminder on screen here that the show is open until the Saturday, July 1st. Cannot believe it is July, actually.
Right?
Yeah. But I also think, like, I was thinking, sorry, I have a lot of thoughts, guys. But I also was thinking about how this exhibition came up like pre-independence, like pre the 50th, and we're like, like being very cynical in a way, in this like cynical, satirical, and like I think someone was like, "Oh, this exhibition is dark," and I'm like, "Great."
Yes.
Yes. And it's like it's counterintuitive to like this culture and the air that's like in the landscape now of just like celebration and like and like very and then like the narratives and the histories of certain people and things are being told in very like specific ways, and I'm just like, y'all need to come see this show.
Yeah. Come see this before you digest all of, what's about to be shoved down your throat in a few days' time.
Yeah.
I mean, I have I've been thinking about too just how much is going to come about the 50th, and I don't know if you guys have done searches of your own, but I've been on the hunt for images, videos, anything really beyond Prince Charles coming to Nassau on this first independence, and has been like seriously searching for gold. It is so challenging to find that image. At the one archive that I found was from a personal archive, and it was images of Freeport, and it was an American photographer who just so happened to be staying for an extended period.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to see what happens, 50 years from now when we look back. Like, what's the 50th independence? What are the stories we're saying? Are we talking about, the everyday Bahamian experience? Or
you said you were looking for images from when he was there 50 years ago, or?
So I'm looking for images of the first Independence Day that pretty much do not show Prince Charles.
Gotcha. That's the one that I got, and it was because my dad was in the background of one while he was dancing with with
Lady
um,
P.
Lady P. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which was weird because it showed how much my brother looks like my dad. He was like 21. So yeah, but that's the only one. So I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah, we were having conversations about archives this week, about like what is an archive and then like accessibility to archives. And I think that Bahamians are people that document everything. We just don't share everything. And I think
Right.
that now, because of social media, we're more inclined to share. But I'm pretty sure that I have a grand uncle who carries his like video camera everywhere, and his camera everywhere. That man has like photos of me since I was like, well, like, but
Yeah.
will I see it? No, but it
Right.
exists, and
Yeah.
it's his archive, and it's yeah. So anyway, that is a longer conversation.
Mhm.
Well, I think that I absolutely agree that I know that the images are out there. It's just our culture of sharing, and also I think this culture of like, there's so many times as I was back home and doing Baja archives, and I would ask my Grammy, "Hey, do you know about such and such?" And she'd be like, "Oh yeah," and then go
Yeah,
on a tangent, and I'd be like, "Well, why did you never tell me that story? Or why didn't you tell me about that place? Why didn't you tell me you used to go to that record store?" She would just say, "Well, I didn't think it was important." Right? So
right.
there's this
Mm.
notion
Yeah,
kind of culturally about what is significant to be considered, a part of the history, a part of that archive, that it's worth, quote unquote, worthwhile sharing.
yeah.
A big part of what I do too, I think, dispelling that um,
Mhm.
and yeah, I'm hopeful that one day I will, be able to get those images. But then also,
Yeah.
when we're at 100 years, that we're looking back and we're not dealing with similar gaps
Right.
in that
And
story.
I think it's nice that younger people seem more interested in these things now. One of the things that my grandmother always lamented was she would always say, "I can only talk to you about this stuff because like I want to share it with like no one else." So she would be like, "Oh, my kids, so no one in the community, like younger people, just seem to be to not have that interest in their own history." And then you have things like this pop up, 50 years in, and you'd probably have to put out a call on like
Yeah,
ZNS or something for people to be like, "Oh, I have some photos from then,"
yeah.
because they just don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think I'll just tackle this question if that's okay, Tiara. But
Mhm.
as it stands, the exhibition will not be exhibited anywhere after July 1st. There is a virtual exhibition, a link to a virtual exhibition that we can share with you, Mr. Darling, if you wish. And all artworks exhibited at Turing Gallery are for sale. And you could reach out to us at info@turngallery.com if you have any like further sales inquiries. So thank you for your question.
And thank you, everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you, Jody and Drew, for all your time.
Thank you.
I am so grateful. um, and sorry, did we have one? Okay. But thank you again, everybody. I just saw another little comment, but it was just Mr. Darling saying thank you guys for your
Oh,
response.
thanks to Mr. Darling for the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but this was fun. Jody knows I tend not to bother, but I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Have a great evening, and to everyone else as well.
And thank you, Ramel, for the tech support behind the scenes.
Yes.
Yes, thanks, Ramel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Alrighty. Bye.